My guest today is a fellow personal trainer, but not in the traditional sense. A true student of the game on an entirely different level, his passion for knowledge on subjects such as physics, biology, and biomechanics make him one of the smartest guys I know. He has a YouTube channel where he creates some of the most in-depth yet easily understood content on exercise and nutrition that I've seen in some time. With accolades like that, it's no wonder he's known as the muscle philosopher. Please welcome Jerome Armstrong. Jerome, welcome, buddy. Good to see you again.
John, thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you.
Oh, man, I'm glad you could join me for the very first episode of the JAK'ed Up podcast, my very first guest, and I couldn't think of a better person to do this with.
Well, I appreciate you having me. I'm flattered, so thank you.
Absolutely. Now, you and I have something in common. Well, we have many things in common. We're both coaches and things of that nature. But right now, the biggest thing we have in common is that we're both doing the carnivore diet. Why don't you tell people a little bit more about how you got into carnivore?
Sure. So for the longest time, I was an if it fits your macros guy. You had a caloric ceiling that you could eat every single day. It didn't really matter food type. And the more I became interested in ketogenic diets because of ketone physiology and how they're metabolized in the body versus glucose, tried a ketogenic diet, had a pretty good degree of success with it, and really wanted to optimize my ketogenic diet. I was looking at the RDAs, how many of each micronutrient do I need? How much fiber do I need every single day? What would an optimized ketogenic diet look like for overall human health? And in looking at different food sources, trying to make sure I got enough fiber, enough omega-3 fatty acids, not too many omega-6 fatty acids, my ketogenic diet had basically been reduced down to a lot of chicken, a lot of like spinach and spring mix, bell peppers, a little bit of tomatoes, and predominantly chia seeds and avocado for fat and for omega-3s and for fiber.
Right.
So around that time, I previously heard of the carnivore diet, people that just eat red meat. And I kind of scoffed at it, thinking there's got to be tremendous nutritional deficiencies until I heard Michaela Peterson on Joe Rogan's podcast. And here's a young lady, I think at the time she did that interview, she was 19. But from the time she was a little kid, she had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, had a couple joint replacements in her hip and her ankle. She had depression and anxiety really bad, energy issues. And she basically started biohacking her own health to try and figure out, okay, this isn't healthy. This isn't normal. This isn't sustainable. I can't live like this any longer. And she started gradually reducing what food she was eating to see what was triggering her. And over the course of a couple of years, she basically got that down to fatty cuts of red meats, vegetables, salt, and water. And then she eventually cut out the vegetables. And her dad, Toronto professor and YouTube intellectual Jordan Peterson, also had a tremendous anxiety and some other issues. And he ended up adopting her diet and actually went off all of his anxiety medication. So I was really, really intrigued about carnivore. And then I watched more stuff by Sean Baker. Here's a guy that's in his 50s that has multiple world record indoor rowing records, eating just red meats. And I started noticing, a lot of these people that are on carnivore, they're all pretty jacked and like they all seem to be really positive. There's lots of anecdotes about people getting off anxiety and depression medication, having autoimmune issues clear up. Maybe there's something to this. So I found a video on YouTube on a YouTube channel called What I've Learned, where it breaks down the carnivore diet. Could it work? Is it nutritionally complete? What about fiber? What about anti-nutrients and plants? And after I watched this video, and it's like 15 minutes long, I just decided, what the hell? I'm just going to give it a try. So June 3rd, 2019 was the first day of my carnivore diet. And after 3 days on carnivore, after 3 days of eating nothing but red meat, salt, and water, it was the morning of day number 4. And I got out of bed and I started walking downstairs. And I noticed that my knees didn't hurt. My knees felt really, really soft and really cushiony. And I didn't have any pain in my ankle. I didn't have any pain in my right hip like I had typically had. And I think sometimes and this was never like a consistent long-term chronic pain that had constantly bothered me. But I think sometimes if you have a really small nagging pain, and if you live with it long enough, you just kind of forget that you have it.
Yep.
So I was walking down the stairs. I thought, oh my God, my knees feel great. And when I went to put on my shoes that day, I bent straight over to get my shoes on. I didn't bend awkwardly at an angle
Right.
because my back didn't hurt, my hip didn't hurt, my knees didn't hurt.
Hmm.
And so on morning number 4, I said, this is it. I'm sold. I'll figure out the nutrients. If I'm not getting enough micronutrients, I can take a multivitamin. But I am going to eat this way for the foreseeable future for a very long
Right.
time because I was just shocked at how good my joints felt.
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
how I got into carnivore.
Yeah, and see that's kind of why I got into it, but because I've been doing a lot of research about it and I've heard about the inflammation and stuff like that. And with me just recently having knee replacement surgery, inflammation is a really big thing. Once they go hacking off the end of your bones and putting your knees in there, you get a lot of inflammation. And I was reading about the carnivore diet and all of those anti-inflammatory aspects were coming up. But what actually got me started in it was I did a podcast with Rob Goodwin, he runs Ketogenic Bodybuilding, which is a group on Facebook. He also has a website. He does online personal training and stuff like this. Well, he is an expert at bodybuilding in keto. He's been doing it for well over 10 years, not only training people in his hybrid style of keto, but also he has adapted all different types of things and put everything together. Like, there's your regular keto diet and there's a targeted ketogenic diet and there's a cyclical ketogenic diet. Well, he's kind of combined the best of all those to make this hybrid style. So we had a really good podcast and we were kind of bullshitting around a little bit at the end of it. And he was telling me that his group was getting ready to do a carnivore challenge for the entire month of February. And as I said, with me coming back from the surgery and getting the green light to get my butt in the gym and lose this almost 50 pounds that I gained last year from being inactive with the knee issues, I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this with you. And I'm going to tell you, I'm full all the time. I'm finding that I'm not eating. I have trouble actually hitting my macros because I don't want to eat. I always feel like I'm full. It's kind of crazy. So there are a lot of benefits to it already that I've found, and I haven't even been on it a month. You've been on it for going on a year now. So you've got reduced inflammation. Have you experienced the lack of appetite? You're not hungry all the time. What other things have you gotten out of it?
Sure. So I tend to at this point now, I used to kind of look at it I think the way that you do now, where you have your macros and your targeted nutrition for the course of the day, that this is the number of calories, this is how much protein I want to hit. And where I'm at now, having done this for a little over 8 months, soon to be 9 months, on probably 90 to 95% carnivore on a given week or month, I tend to look at it now that I just eat when I'm hungry and I don't eat when I'm not. And regardless of whether or not I lift weights that day, if I'm not hungry, I won't eat. And I have no loss of strength in the gym. I tend to think my body fat's at a pretty decent level. But I don't look at it in terms of like, these are all the nutrients I need in a day. I look at it as at this point now where if I'm hungry and truly hungry, because sometimes you can just have that little tiny twinge and you start thinking like, I guess I could eat. I usually wait till that hunger is like, okay, I'm hungry now. I need to eat something.
Right.
And I think if you do it long enough and if you're getting enough nutrient dense foods, that hunger becomes a reliable arbiter of whether or not you should eat. And to make a distinction, I think there's 2 types of hunger. I think there's energy hunger and I think there's nutrient hunger.
Oh yeah.
I think if you're micronutrient deficient, I think our body has some mechanism in place to think that it wants you to eat food, thinking if you just get enough food that you'll get whatever micronutrients you need. But there's also certainly energy hunger where you just need protein, carbs, and fats to fuel whatever activity it is you're performing.
Right.
So now most days, I have some days I eat twice a day. I have some days, actually most days I eat once a day. And then sometimes I'll go 2 or 3 days without eating, and then I'll just have a massive meal. I try and keep it based on when I get a decent, appreciable hunger, and that's when I eat now.
Right.
And likewise, I seldom crave anything. So I was shocked at how much a carnivore diet blunts hunger, and you've certainly seen that within 30 days. And I think
Oh yeah.
a couple more months, if you stayed on carnivore, I think it would be that much more profound. That hunger is something you will seldom experience again, and
Right.
it's fascinating in
Mhm.
that regard.
That's a good thing. And I probably will stay carnivore because with my schedule right now, things are so hectic. It can
Mm,
actually be kind of crazy to take time away from whatever it is I'm doing to go eat. And I'm one of those people. I'm all for if you're the type of person that has to prep your meals because that's your way of staying accountable and make sure that you get all your macro and micronutrients in. I'm all about that, and I teach my
mm,
clients that. But I'm one of those people. I like my food fresh. Okay, I don't want
mm,
to because I my protein sources are I eat like eye round steaks, pork loin cut into pork chops, salmon. Every now and then I'll eat some tuna, and none of those things I like to cook and then put in the refrigerator or whatever, and then take it out and heat it up and eat it. I don't like to do that. I like my foods fresh, and fortunately, my lifestyle has me to where most of the time, unless I'm in the gym training a client, I'm working from home, so I can take a break and go fix myself something to eat. Um, but
mm.
a lot of people can't, and that can be difficult for a diet like the carnivore diet because of the fact that people tend to focus on red meats and things like that. So, from that aspect, what advice would you give somebody that's looking to do carnivore if they were in a situation like me where they don't like to have cold food or reheated food?
Sure. I think I would preface that by saying both you and I are first committed to somebody's health and their
Yes.
safety, and
Yep.
and after that to their results. So,
Mm-hmm.
if somebody's carnivore-ish, if somebody's meat-based instead of plant-based, however they define it, and you know what, even if somebody's vegan, if they're healthy and if they're moving in the direction of what they want to achieve with their life and their physique and their energy levels, that's
Yep.
great.
Right.
But we're so different as individuals, to some degree based on our physiology, but also on our individual preferences. That
Right.
as a coach, you really have to get inside somebody's head and find what is going to work best for them. So, one of
Yeah.
the questions I usually ask when I first start working with people is, what have you tried before that's worked, and why do you think it worked? Some people love the meal prep. They get their food containers, they cook up everything on Sunday, and then they have
Right.
like 30 Tupperwares with all of their food Monday through Friday.
Yeah.
And some people love that and it works great for them. And I would not change that at all. Um, some people, yeah, if you're working 9 to 5 and your office has donuts, um, and you're trying to have a carnivore diet, certainly some degree of food prep is probably going to be more advantageous than being surrounded by that food that's available at any given point in time.
Right.
You can do some things, and it's going to come down to preferences. So, you could prep food at home, and like, I'm I'm a big advocate of just keep it simple and keep it easy. So when I cook up a bunch of burger patties, because that's one of my primary sources of
Right.
protein, I just get a sheet pan for the oven and I just load it up with burgers and I throw it in the oven for 20 minutes. And then whether I
Mm-hmm.
eat that all at once or whether I have burgers in the fridge that I can just chew on later,
Right.
um, and even then I would rather just eat them cold than heat them up. But
Yeah.
that's me. I would rather just grab a patty and gnaw on it while I'm
Mm-hmm.
working on something or while I'm prepping something for a client. um, but you really have to find what works for you, and that's something that can take some trial and error, or you can often just reflect on your own experiences. What have you tried before that's worked, and then what were the aspects about it that you think made it work?
Yeah.
But more often than not, it's going to come down to, what are your preferences as an individual? The advantage of carnivore or of any diet, I think if any diet can first control hunger, I think that's huge. And second, if you can control cravings, I think it makes a lot of those social situations a lot easier, like an
Oh yeah.
office. So carnivore being extremely mitigating on hunger and reducing sugar cravings. Once an individual is kind of used to carnivore, they could probably just go to the office and not even be fazed by the donuts that are being passed around or by the piece of cake that's
Right.
being cut for somebody's birthday party.
Hmm.
Um, but there's also that balance. So some people want to have that cake, and it's a highly individualized thing. So it's hard to prescribe rigid guidelines. And I think as trainers and coaches, we're better off making sure our clients understand principles and then working with them to make the best applications of those principles based on their individual preferences.
Right. Right. And see, that's where my problem is. I'm a fat kid at heart. Let me tell you, there is absolutely nothing I love more than to sit down in front of the TV on the couch, fireplace going, and I've got a big old bag of nachos and a bowl full of queso and just chow down. I love to do that type of stuff. But I
Mhm.
know that if I do it, that it's going to have adverse effects on my health and on my goals of what it is that I'm trying to do. So I try to
Yeah.
avoid it. Do I give in every now and then? Absolutely. Let me tell you, brother, my birthday was in January, and we had all my boys were over, and we had pizzas, and we were watching wrestling, and yeah, it's like I ate a whole pizza and a bunch of stuff that I shouldn't have eaten. But it's okay. It's all right to do that stuff every now and then, but you definitely can't do that if you're on carnivore, because if you're trying to do carnivore and you go eating pizza, it's definitely counterintuitive to what you're doing, without a doubt. So let me ask you, because a lot of people talk about the lack of nutrients that you can have when it comes to being on a carnivore diet, because they say so many nutrients, so many vitamins and minerals that you would normally get from plant sources, you're not getting. So because of that, carnivore is not healthy. Why don't you
Mhm.
talk on that a little bit? Because I know you've actually done some presentations on your YouTube channel and whatnot. So
Yep.
why don't you just kind of touch on that a bit?
Sure. So that was one of my primary concerns when I first started carnivores. Am I getting enough micronutrients? And I firmly believe that if I had a multivitamin, and I look at multivitamins like an insurance policy. You probably don't need it, but it's good to have just in case.
Right.
Um, so then I downloaded an app called Chronometer. It's a free app, and what you can do is you can plug in your foods, and it references the USDA's food database, and it tracks all of the micronutrients that you eat.
Right.
So I took a standard day of carnivore for me. So when I first started carnivore, I looked at it like these are the nutrients, and this is the amount of protein that I need every single day. As
Mm-hmm.
we're now, I tend to look at it like I call it intermittent feasting, and that term comes from Sean Baker. I
Right.
eat when I'm hungry, but then I have a massive meal, and I don't care if it's one meal a day, one meal every third day, two
Mm-hmm.
meals a day. I eat when I'm hungry and I eat till I'm full. But backtracking, I looked at it like these are the RDAs. This is what I should get every single day.
Right.
This is how much protein I should get, and I should kind of focus on omega 3s and omega 6s.
Right.
So what I did is I took an average day of eating for me back then, which was 2 pounds of red meat, usually just ground beef or frozen burger patties, half an ounce of beef liver, and 4 egg yolks. And I
Okay.
plugged it in a chronometer, and I pulled up, and I took 2 screenshots with my phone. I said, this is what chronometer is telling me, all the micronutrients that I'm getting through my diet.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that on your screen now, um, as a certain measurement related to the RDA. So
Right.
then, excuse me, I looked at what micronutrients could I possibly be deficient in. Vitamin C, and I said I might be deficient because these micronutrients I would have less than 50% of the RDA. Vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin K, calcium, and manganese. Every other micronutrient I was getting more than enough of. So vitamin C is where I started. This is the big one that's most readily not available on a carnivore diet. Everyone thinks
Right.
you're going to get scurvy if you go carnivore. The
Mm-hmm.
RDA for vitamin C is 90 milligrams a day. and the tolerable upper limit is, I believe, 1 or 2,000 milligrams a day. So
Right.
the recommended amount is you should get 90 milligrams a day. But in doing a little research, I found a couple interesting things. First, they've done interventional studies to look at what's the least amount of vitamin C that they need to give somebody to not only prevent scurvy, but also reverse it. So
Right.
if you have this condition from a vitamin C deficiency, you certainly need more than you would use on a regular basis to reverse that condition.
Right.
And they found in this intervention study that 10 milligrams a day of vitamin C was sufficient to reverse scurvy. So I thought,
Hmm.
okay, you probably don't need that much to keep scurvy at bay. And there is a valid question that could be asked is a higher amount optimal? And I don't know the answer to that question. I just want to be very intellectually honest in that regard. More vitamin
Right.
C may be optimal, but in terms of preventing any amount that you could have from a lack of vitamin C, it's about 10 milligrams a day.
Right.
And when you go onto the USDA's food database, on the USDA's website, they admit that vitamin C is just not measured for. They don't test for vitamin C in red muscle meat.
Okay.
Some of it is lost when you cook, but it's been demonstrated by, I think, Lloyd and Sinclair in 1953 or 1955 that meat does have vitamin C in it.
Hmm.
Muscle meat has 10 to 15 milligrams basically per pound. Organ meats like beef liver have a little bit more. And then if you're feeling really adventurous or you have kidney or thymus or adrenal gland, those have more vitamin C still.
Wow.
So if you're eating what's known as nose to tail in carnivore, that you're focusing on, yes, muscle meat, but also organ meats, also connective tissue. Um, and the thought process of that is if you were to go out during hunting season and get a deer, and say it's 500 years ago and you get a deer, you would eat every scrap of meat off of that deer that you
Everything.
could,
Absolutely.
because that would be to sustain yourself and your family or your tribe or whoever you're living with. You
Sure.
get everything you could off of that animal. And when you start looking at some of these different organs, you find that they have a better micronutrient profile than just muscle meat alone.
Right.
But in eating 2 pounds of red meat a day, if 1 pound of red meat has 10 to 15 milligrams of vitamin C, even if some of that is lost in cooking, if I'm having 2 pounds of red meat a day plus a little bit of beef liver every single day, I am more than meeting my needs for vitamin C, certainly to prevent scurvy, but also to
Right.
just maintain a good degree of health.
Hmm.
So, my position then, if I'm only getting a small percentage of my RDA for vitamin C, that
Hmm.
vitamins that I'm a little bit closer in, vitamin E, vitamin K, and there's K1 and K2,
Right.
calcium and manganese. If I'm eating nose to tail and I'm having different protein sources, the manganese, for example, I think one serving of mussels or oysters has well over 500% of the RDA of manganese.
Uh-huh.
Um, if I vary up my protein sources, even intermittently, between vitamin C being the most apparently lacking, I am getting more than enough micronutrients,
Right.
as evidenced by my micronutrient profiles on Chronometer.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, that's the thing. So many people get wrapped up in all that because everybody has their own concept. Well, for so many years, it was like the government, the Food and Drug Administration, your teachers at school, nurses, all that type of stuff. You have to eat your vegetables. You have to eat your fruits. You have to eat this because it's the only way you're going to be healthy. And that was, I mean, I can remember sitting in nutrition classes back in the early 70s because I'm an old folk. and but I can remember them saying you had to eat like three pieces of some kind of fruit a day, 3 servings of fruit a day, and you needed to eat as many vegetables as possible and all these different things. And it's amazing how, fast forward 50 some years and they're finding out that that is not necessarily the case. And we don't need a lot of these things. It's like
Mm.
for years, everybody thought that you had to have carbohydrates in your diet. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any energy. You wouldn't be able to work out. You wouldn't be able to build muscle and all these things. And now we're finding out that that's not true. So it's
Mhm.
amazing what research reveals, without a doubt.
Yeah, and like I say, I think most research scientists and doctors and epidemiologists have the best of intentions in mind and generally make the
Well,
best
sure.
conclusions they have based on the available data. I'm more than happy to grant that as an assumption of mine.
Hmm.
But what I usually go back to is vegan cardiologist, Dr. Joel Kahn, on his podcast with Chris Kresser, or sorry, it was Joe Rogan's podcast, but they had a debate talking about the Game Changers movie.
Oh, yeah.
Joel Kahn said that 80% of dietary recommendations come from epidemiology. And epidemiology is largely tracking various populations based on food surveys and then observing health effects. So if a certain population is known to, let's just say, eat large amounts of brown rice, and we find that they live longer. What's often suggested based on these epidemiologic studies then is brown rice may enhance lifespan, and that's not necessarily true.
No.
I contend that epidemiology is a good place to establish some degree of correlation that might merit interventional study or randomized clinical trial.
Right.
But I think determining nutritional guidelines based on epidemiology is looking at it the wrong way. I think instead, we know a tremendous amount about how the human body acts on the cellular level, and we understand human physiology in such a great level of detail that that's where we ought to start.
Sure.
And the way I generally introduce that is I advocate a zero carb diet for most individuals if they want my personal idea of what I think is optimal for human health, almost entirely because the human bloodstream can only have about 4 to 5 grams of sugar in it. More than that, and you can have kidney problems, you can have nerve damage, you have capillary issues. To think that the majority of our dietary guidelines suggest 45 to 65% of your total calories coming from carbohydrate, knowing physiologically that every single carbohydrate you ingest is converted into sugar, and either it goes to the liver or the muscles as glycogen or ends up in the bloodstream. To me, it's looking at things from the wrong direction. We need to look from inside out based on what we know, not on the macro level in terms of populations, and then try and scale it down to the individual.
Right. Yeah. It's like what I think the epidemiology should be doing. It should be just simply like planting little flags and saying, okay, we need to take a look at this, rather than basing an entire diet off something like, prime example, the Mediterranean diet. That is pure epidemiology right there. They look at the Mediterranean populations and their health span and their reduced markers for A, B, and C, and that's how they base the diet. And they didn't really do a ton of research on it before everybody started touting it as the next latest and greatest thing. And the other thing too that I want to touch on that you were just talking about is the carbohydrates. And I'm like you. Probably about 90% of my clients I either have on a low carb or zero carb diet. They're either on keto or something to that effect. And the reason is most people do not understand that if you have, say you're eating 80 grams of carbs every meal, okay, but you work a desk job, you don't need those 80 grams of carbs at breakfast. You don't need them at lunch. If your cells are full, if your muscle cells are full, and you're not utilizing that glucose for energy, it goes to the liver. And when it gets to the liver says, hey, I need to turn this into fat, and we need to pack this someplace so we can store it for later use. So, for all those middle-aged ladies who are worried about their figure, and they're sitting there eating all these extra carbohydrates, the liver's saying, let me just take this and put it right over here on this ass cheek, or do this because, if you take it and you visualize it like that, it makes sense. You know what I mean? But so many people don't, because they don't understand the inner workings of the body and the metabolism in and of itself. And they don't understand that they're actually being counterintuitive, when it comes to fat loss, which is what most people are after when it comes to health and fitness. So,
yeah, totally agree. I did a presentation on YouTube called "Do You Need Carbohydrates?" And I tried to make it an all-encompassing presentation on how carbohydrates are metabolized. Well, what about gluten insensitivity and celiac?
Right.
Do you need fiber? Do you need fiber to ward off colorectal cancer? And I tried to make it encompassing with how is glucose metabolized, how is fructose metabolized, and this is a graph that I used from a presentation by Dr. Paul Mason, who is a low-carb ketogenic diet advocate. And this is an interventional study that he brought up where they were testing the various effects of dietary carbohydrate on individuals with a number of known gastrointestinal issues. So for people that may not be able to read the screen, constipation, strained opening, bloating, anal bleeding, and pain were all tested. So there was the baseline diet, and then some individuals were fed more fiber. Some people had a reduced fiber diet, and some people were on a zero fiber diet. And what they found was a really, really strong, statistically significant correlation that the more fiber people ate in this interventional study, the more gastrointestinal issues that they had. So virtually every marker, especially anal bleeding and pain, is increased with the high fiber group. But what they noticed with the zero fiber group is the people that had zero fiber, so no fruits, no vegetables, no grains, had a complete cessation of all physical symptoms. They weren't constipated. They didn't have any problem going to the bathroom. And then all of these other issues just completely resolved. And to look at things, and this might be too broad of a generalization, this might be too superficial, but in a sense, if you think we need to eat indigestible material to facilitate digestion, I don't know if I necessarily buy into that idea. We literally, as people, cannot physiologically digest fiber. We lack the enzymes to break down the cellulose that makes up the cell wall of different plants. And because of that, it physically passes right through us. And maybe the better metaphor is if you have a traffic jam during rush hour, and this is your gastrointestinal tract, if you try and introduce fiber to get things moving along, that's just like adding more cars to the road. It's not going to help things move along more quickly. It's just going to bundle things up more. And then there's also the issue that soluble fiber especially can reduce the amount of vitamins and minerals that your body is able to absorb. So if you take soluble fiber and you put it in a glass of water, you mix it up and you let it settle for a little bit, you can see that these little tiny gel balls float to the top of your water glass. Now, soluble fiber has been shown to be beneficial using that same mechanism in reducing certain toxins that the body absorbs, because in a sense, it binds with water and some of these things get caught in with the fiber as well. But the same thing happens with vitamins and minerals. So this particular interventional study that Paul Mason brought up in one of his presentations, I think is a fantastic example that we don't need fiber, and fiber in the most rudimentary sense is indigestible. Our bodies can't break it down and metabolize it. It just passes right through us if our GI tract is healthy. And if we do have GI issues, this poses a strong case that more fiber might be bad for us, and reducing fiber or eliminating fiber may actually promote better health.
Right. Yeah. What do you say? Well, I mean, let's face facts here. We've already seen a slide on pain and anal bleeding, so let's get right down to it. Do you have you experienced any problems with bowel movements or anything like that while on the carnivore diet?
There's the misconception that the average American has 3 to 5 pounds of red meat sitting undigested in their gut.
Yep.
And that's essentially a lie. Red meat is very easily digested. When I was in nursing school, I had a rotation working as a CNA. So for anybody that has an ostomy bag, what you find is if you feed them meat, when it hits that point in the digestive tract, it's all liquid. It's not this big mass of undigested ribeye that's sitting in your small intestine having a hard time making it through. Meat is extremely digestible and extremely easy on us. So everyone wants to talk poop, and I don't get it, but I have one normal bowel movement, every 1 to 3 days, and no straining and no pressure. And I suppose since you posed that question to me, I in the interest of sharing, you should probably tell everybody.
Oh no, absolutely, I will. Both on keto and on carnivore, I've never had an issue. I do when I'm on regular keto, I do, like I say, eat macadamia nuts or some almonds, but even that I don't eat a whole lot of, and I don't eat a lot of cruciferous vegetables. So yeah, I mean, but I've never had an issue regardless. Keto, carnivore, it doesn't matter. So for those people out there that are saying, well, if you don't have X amount of fiber in your diet, if you're not getting that, if you're avoiding that, you're going to have problems. You're going to have all this undigested stuff in the bowel. And I don't see any clinical evidence of it to be fact. And anecdotal evidence on myself, on you, and a lot of other people that I've talked to, it's horse crap, literally crap.
Could I interject quick to make a couple small points in regards to that too? One thing that, and now to be fair, a lot of people that start a ketogenic diet or start carnivore often have loose bowel movements initially, sometimes for the first week, 2 weeks, month. And two possible mechanisms to come to mind quickly for me. The first is your body hasn't produced enough digestive enzymes, enough lipase to break down all of the fat that you're consuming. So a lot of the fat is running through you undigested, especially if you're new to low carb, your fat consumption tends to be higher. And it takes time and the body ends up making more bile and more lipase so it can break down and metabolize that fat. And then second is your gut microbiome, which I don't think we really know a lot about, but it's a really exciting field of study that we should learn a lot about in the human body. But your biome kind of adjusts to the foods that you eat. So if you're eating a carbohydrate-based diet and you suddenly deprive yourself of carbohydrates and especially sugar, a lot of those bacteria die and then are passed through the GI tract and eliminated by the body. So at least initially on a ketogenic or low carb diet, some people do have loose stools. Some people do have, certainly not constipation, but we brought up poop. So in the interest of intellectual honesty, probably should cover that some people have issues there too.
Yeah. I mean, Jerome, when you get right down to it, I mean, you know this as well as I do. If our body actually needs glucose, we can make it without taking in carbohydrates.
Yep. My understanding is every cell in the body that has mitochondria can use ketone bodies from fat metabolism for an energy source. That being said, there are, I believe, 2 types of cells in the bodies that don't have mitochondria. There's red blood cells or erythrocytes, and then there's a couple cells in the eye that also need glucose. But the body can perform what's called gluconeogenesis to create glucose from different constituent fuels when necessary. Glucose or gluconeogenesis is a demand-driven process. So we can use dietary fat, dietary protein, body fat, or in a pinch, muscle protein. But that's usually seen as kind of a last-ditch effort in extreme starvation examples to create glucose. So the problem with large amounts of dietary carbohydrate trying to meet that need for glucose is 1, it spikes your blood sugar. 2, you can become insulin resistant from the large insulin bolus, which is a response to large carbohydrate ingestion. And insulin, and just like every other hormone in the body, serves multiple purposes based on what cells are utilizing it. So yes, insulin is a storage hormone, but it also turns off beta oxidation of fats. It doesn't make sense for your body to be trying to make fat and store energy and burn energy at the same time. So when your insulin level is elevated above baseline, it's in storage mode. You're trying to put glycogen into the muscles, into the liver, and then substrate into adipocytes or fat cells for energy uses later. So it turns off beta oxidation, so you're burning fat. And if burning fat is a primary concern, which it is with most people that we work with, they want to bring their body fat down, they want to be a little bit healthier. It stands to reason that frequent consumption of large amounts of carbohydrates is almost entirely necessary so that your body can switch over to fat burning mode. But yeah, gluconeogenesis can happen from protein, which is not very easily done. Every single food you eat, protein, carbs, fats, it's all broken down and converted into energy. So when you eat dietary protein, it's broken down through a number of enzymes into amino acids. The amino acids that are needed are used by the body, and then the amino acids that aren't needed go to the liver and undergo a process called deamination, and most of it's converted into eventually urea, first ammonia, then urea, and then it's basically you pee it out. Likewise, dietary fat that you consume, it's all broken down into ketones. And the ketones can be used in converting to acetyl coenzyme A to fuel the TCA cycle, TCA cycle. But the conversion of fat into ketone bodies is about 40% thermic. And then, as you know, excess ketones are excreted through the breath and also through the urine. So people
Right.
can do urine ketone tests. So there's a little bit of a wasting effect that happens with excess protein consumption and excess fat consumption
Right.
that doesn't happen with excess carbohydrate consumption. It's not a small amount, but I was getting back on track. Your body's extremely adaptive.
Yep.
We have survived over a very long period of time to be able to use a variety of substrate to fuel most cellular processes that we need. So if your body needs glucose, if you're consuming a zero carbohydrate diet, your body can break down body fat. And that's usually what happens. Your glucagon goes up. It tells your adipocytes to release triglycerides. The triglycerides are broken down into 3 fatty acids and then glycerol. And the glycerol is converted to glucose, and the glucose can go wherever it's needed.
Yep.
So you have zero need for dietary carbohydrates. And given that you have zero need for dietary carbohydrates, and certainly our limited capacity in our blood for carbohydrates, I find it almost criminal that the dietary recommendations are 45 to 65% dietary carbohydrates.
Yeah, I know. I deal with that so often with people. They're like, well, I thought I was supposed to be eating 100 grams of carb a day or 200 grams of carb. I'm like, no, you don't need that. You don't have to have it.
Yeah.
If you're one of those people that exercises, vigorously 5-6 days a week, plus you have a physical job, maybe, but not as it stands if you're just, Joe Blow regular person. So as far as that goes. Okay. Well, I think that's pretty much going to wrap things up for this one, Jerome. I sure do want to thank you, as again, I said, being my first guest on the first episode. But I'll get it out here. First episode of the brand new JAK'ed Up podcast. But before we go, real quick, let everybody know where they can find you as far as your social media and whatnot.
Sure. You can find me at facebook.com/themusclephilosopher, one long word, Instagram, The Muscle Philosopher, or send me an email, themusclephilosopher@gmail.com.
There you go, guys. All right, Jerome. Well, thank you. And I'm sure we'll get together and do another one again soon.
Anytime you want, brother.
All right. Take care.